Imagine paying taxes to a country 3,000 miles away, but having absolutely no say in how that country is run. Sounds like a nightmare, right? Like getting charged a subscription fee for a gym you've never been to in a city you've never visited, run by people who don't know you exist. Well, that was basically life in the 1700s if you lived in the 13 American colonies. So let's talk about it. Okay, so back then, the colonies were part of the British Empire, and honestly, most colonists were totally fine with that. They considered themselves loyal British citizens. They drank the tea, they tipped their little hats, they were proud to be British. No drama. But then Britain went and fought this giant, expensive war called the French and Indian War. And wars, as it turns out, are not cheap. Britain came out of it absolutely drowning in debt. So Britain looked around like, who can pay for this mess? And their eyes landed on the colonies. Cha-ching. Suddenly, Britain starts taxing everything. There was the Stamp Act, which taxed paper. Then the Townshend Acts, which taxed all sorts of imported stuff. Then the Tea Act, because of course they came for the tea. And here's the part that drove everybody nuts. The colonists had 0 representatives in Parliament, none. So they were getting taxed by a government they literally could not vote for or argue with. That's where the famous phrase comes from. No taxation without representation. Which is basically the 18th century version of I'm not paying for something I didn't agree to. And the frustration kept building and building until it boiled over into one of the weirdest protests in human history, the Boston Tea Party. Now, when I first heard Tea Party, I pictured something cute, little cups, maybe some crackers. I was so wrong. What actually happened is a bunch of colonists disguised themselves, snuck onto British ships in Boston Harbor, and dumped 342 entire chests of tea straight into the ocean. We're talking tea worth well over $1 million in today's money. Just gone, floating away. The fish that night were absolutely buzzing on caffeine, and Britain was not amused at all. So Britain hit back with a series of laws so harsh the colonists nicknamed them the Intolerable Acts, which, by the way, is an incredible name. If your enemy names your laws the Intolerable Acts, you might have gone a little too far. These acts punished Massachusetts super hard. Shut down the harbor, took away local power, the whole deal. Britain was trying to make an example out of them, but here's what's funny. Instead of scaring the other colonies into behaving, it did the opposite. The colonies looked at Massachusetts getting wrecked and went, yeah, no, we're not into this. And they started uniting. That's how you get the first Continental Congress. A bunch of delegates from the colonies meeting up, comparing notes, all increasingly annoyed at the same guy. They tried to negotiate, they really did, but the talks went nowhere. And then, on April 19th, 1775, things stopped being talk. Fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord. This is where you get the famous line, the shot heard around the world. The moment the Revolutionary War officially kicked off. Fun little detail, though. To this day, nobody actually knows who fired that first shot. Both sides were like, it wasn't us. It's history's greatest game of he started it. But that shot, whoever fired it, changed everything. Okay, now here's where I need you to really pay attention, because this is the part most people get totally wrong, including me for like my entire life. Most people think America became independent on July 4th, 1776. It did not. The Continental Congress actually voted for independence on July 2nd, 2 whole days earlier. July 2nd was the real decision day. So why do we celebrate the 4th? Because 2 days after the vote on July 4th, Congress approved the final wording of the Declaration of Independence, the document, the fancy paper. That's the date that ended up printed on it. And the Declaration was mostly written by Thomas Jefferson, who got stuck with the homework assignment of writing it. Imagine being the guy in the group project who has to write the part that gets remembered for 250 years. Now, here's another thing people misunderstand. The declaration was not a peace treaty. It did not end the war. The war hadn't even really gotten going yet. The declaration was basically a bold public announcement to the entire world. The colonies stood up and said, "Hey everybody, we consider ourselves free and independent states now, just so you know." It was the mic drop, not the victory lap. And here's a fun one. You know that classic image of all the founders gathered around signing the Declaration on July 4th? Yeah, that mostly didn't happen. Most of the delegates didn't sign on July 4th at all. A bunch of them signed weeks later, on August 2nd. So that dramatic painting of everyone signing together is a little, let's say, generous with the truth. Oh, and here's my favorite character in this whole story, John Adams. John Adams was absolutely convinced that Americans would celebrate independence on July 2nd. He wrote about it. He was like, July 2nd is the day. There will be fireworks and parades and celebrations forever. And he was right about the fireworks and parades part. He was just off by 2 days on the date. Poor guy nailed the vibe and missed the calendar. Anyway, so America made its big announcement. But announcing something and actually pulling it off are two very different things. Because Britain looked at this declaration and went, "That's adorable," and refused to recognize it completely. So now the colonies had to actually win the freedom they just announced, which meant 7 more years of war. 7. That's the part nobody puts on the fireworks merch. July 4th was the easy part, the talking part. After that came the brutal, exhausting, this is actually really hard part. There were some massive turning points along the way, like the Battle of Saratoga, which was a huge American win that convinced France to jump in and help. And having France on your side in the 1700s was a pretty big deal. And then there was Yorktown, the decisive victory, the one that basically broke Britain's will to keep fighting. But even after Yorktown, it wasn't officially over. Independence didn't become real on paper until 1783, when Britain finally signed the Treaty of Paris and went, "Fine, you're a country, whatever." So let me put this all together because the timeline is honestly wild. July 4th, 1776, America declares independence. 1783, America actually gets independence. That's 7 years apart. The announcement and the actual freedom are 7 years away from each other. So here's the big question. Why do we celebrate July 4th, the day America just announced its plans, instead of 1783, the day America actually won? Because July 4th is the date printed on the Declaration of Independence. It's the day the colonies formally said, "We're done. We're a new nation." It's the moment they made the choice. And honestly, that kind of makes sense. We celebrate the day they had the guts to say it. Everything after that was just the long, painful work of making the words true. Now, before I let you go, I've got to hit you with the weird stuff. Because this story has some coincidences that are genuinely hard to believe. Remember John Adams, the guy who thought we'd celebrate July 2nd? And remember Thomas Jefferson, the guy who wrote the whole Declaration? Both of them died on the exact same day, July 4th, 1826, which was the 50th anniversary to the day of the Declaration being adopted. I'm not kidding. 2 of the most important founders of the country, both dying on July 4th, exactly 50 years later. If you put that in a movie, people would call it lazy writing. And the story behind it gets even spookier. Adams reportedly said, as his last words, something like "Jefferson survives." But he was wrong. Jefferson had actually died a few hours earlier that same day. They were rivals, then friends. Then they both checked out on the country's birthday. But wait, there's more. A third president, James Monroe, also died on July 4th. A few years later, in 1831, 3 presidents, same holiday. The 4th of July apparently does not mess around. And then, just to balance things out, the universe decided to add a plot twist. President Calvin Coolidge was actually born on July 4th. So the holiday giveth and the holiday taketh away. Couple more fun ones before we close. You know the Liberty Bell, the famous one with the big crack in it? They don't actually ring it anymore. They tap it gently. Like you'd tap a friend who fell asleep on the couch because they're terrified of making that crack worse. So one of the most iconic symbols of American freedom is now too fragile to actually make noise. It just gets a polite little tap. Honestly, kind of relatable. And the original declaration itself, the actual document, it's faded. Like really faded. Years and years of being exposed to light wore the ink down. So one of the most important pieces of paper in history is now a little hard to read, which feels like a metaphor or something. The words faded, but the idea didn't. So here's what I want you to take away from all this. The 4th of July is not the day America won the war. It's not the day the fighting ended. It's not even the day Congress actually voted for independence. It's the day America declared its independence. The day a bunch of people 3,000 miles away from their rulers said, "We're done asking permission." Everything after that, all 7 years of it, was just the hard part. The struggle to turn a really brave sentence into an actual country. So this July 4th, when you're watching fireworks and eating something off a grill, just remember, you're not celebrating the finish line. You're celebrating the moment somebody had the nerve to start the race, and honestly, that might be the better thing to celebrate.